ancient Rome and Egypt to Renaissance Italy with Romeo and Juliet, and China in a sort of timeless legend from China. So the first piece is the one that I'm sure that many of you have not heard. It's by a French composer named Florent Schmitt. And I was just reading a historian recently who said Florent Schmitt is the most important French composer that you never heard of. And that sort of sums it up. He was a very wonderful composer, studied with Massenet and Fauré, won the Prix de Rome, taught at the Paris Conservatory, was very important, especially in the first half of the 20th century. But we don't know about him. And there's probably more political reasons for that than anything else, because sometimes we think, if we don't know a composer, it must be that the music is really not that memorable. But often that's really not the reason. Florent Schmitt happened to be going in a different direction than the prevalent French style at the beginning of the 20th century. The French, in that time, were struggling very hard to create their own music that was very, very different than German music. German music for centuries dominated our music world. That was the center of our world, with the music of Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Brahms, and so on. And France, not only for musical reasons, but very much for political reasons, was trying to create their own cultural identity that was as different from the Germans as possible. And if you listen to the music of Debussy and Ravel, who were the leaders of this school, you realize that they're moving away from the kind of Germanic structure, tradition, rules, the idea of the symphonic four movements and strict thematic relationships, which is, of course, really what German music is all about, into something that's much more based upon color and atmosphere, much like their colleagues in the art world. So French music was moving very strongly in this direction, but not every French composer was doing that. Florent Schmitt happened to be one that was still tied, in a real sense, to a Germanic tradition. And he very much liked the structure and the style of German music and continued to write in that way. In fact, he was a member of a small group of sort of renegade French composers called the Apaches. They called themselves the Apaches. They were between the world wars, and they named it after the Native American tribe, the Apaches, because they thought of themselves as being renegades. They weren't following what the rest of the French school was doing. They were finding their own way, but in doing that, some of their music was just really lost. And I hope that when you hear this, you'll say, well, this is wonderful music to be able to discover. Florent Schmitt was very much drawn to the idea of Antony and Cleopatra, and he was asked to write incidental music for a performance of the Shakespeare play. Actually, two of the pieces on tonight's program are based directly on Shakespeare's work. So Antony and Cleopatra, you may remember the play in which Shakespeare is able to give both of Antony and Cleopatra kind of noble grandeur in their lives and in their death. This is a very tragic, true story. So he was asked to write music, incidental music for the play. And what you hear tonight is three of those movements, three movements taken from the music that would have accompanied the play. When I was studying the score, I went back because I'd forgotten my Roman history, and I went back to look into the story of Antony and Cleopatra. Shakespeare wrote it in the early 17th century, but the story itself, it's just a true story, was first documented by Plutarch centuries before. And the play that Shakespeare wrote is a tragedy, and it's characterized by kind of swift panoramic shifts in geography between the kind of austere, pragmatic Rome that is just becoming the center of the universe and the sensual and very beautiful Alexandria in Egypt, the home of Cleopatra and her court. Mark Antony is one of the trio, the triumvirate of Rome, along with Octavius and Marcus or Aurelius. And he has left Rome at this point in the play. He's left Rome because he's made his way somehow to Alexandria and fell completely in love with the beautiful queen, Cleopatra the Seventh. So I suppose there's a long line of Cleopatras. She was Cleopatra the Seventh. And he didn't come back to Rome, which really displeased the other two members of the triumvirate because they were trying very hard to keep Rome in power and constantly fighting off barbarians and pirates. And at this point, they were really dealing with a very difficult situation with a pirate named Pompey. He was a legend in the Mediterranean. So they insisted that Mark Antony return to Rome. And Mark Antony did return to Rome very reluctantly. Cleopatra did not want him to go, but he went back to Rome, and he's able to put together a truce with Pompey, so that war ends and peace is reestablished in Rome, and then he goes back to Cleopatra. Now, one thing I found out about the Romans, I didn't know this, is that when Mark Antony went and met Cleopatra for the first time, he already had been married 3 times. And it seems that the Romans married a lot. I mean, but serially, they didn't have many wives, but they always married for political reasons. So if a woman came along who seemed to be a better political step for them, they would divorce the wife and marry somebody else. And age didn't matter. We had age matches with 30 or 40, sometimes 50 years in between them because of political reasons. So he'd been married 3 times, and when he went back to Rome, he got married again and returned to Cleopatra. But anyway, the other 2 were very displeased, Marcus Aurelius and Octavian, that he left Rome, and they came after him, and it was a big battle, the Battle of Actium, which you hear in the music, at which Mark Antony and Cleopatra are defeated. And Cleopatra runs back to the palace where her 3 children are there, and Mark Antony is still fighting. And she, in an effort to save him, because Octavian has taken them prisoner in the palace, she sends a message to Mark Antony that she has killed herself and the 3 children, that she's taken her life, hoping that he will flee and not try to come back to the palace where Octavian is ready for him with his soldiers. But Mark Antony, hearing this, kills himself instead, or attempts to kill himself instead. He's dying, and he hears that Cleopatra actually is still alive. So he gets himself back to the court, and he dies in her arms on the steps of the palace. She is so grief-stricken and so unwilling to be brought back to Rome as the spoils of war of Octavian, that she kills herself with a bite of a snake, the very famous suicide that was made famous in paintings. So Shakespeare elevates this to really fantastically noble situation with the 2 of them. And you might remember his very famous, Mark Antony says this, his famous description of Cleopatra to his colleagues, where he says he can't forget her. And these are Shakespeare's words. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Other women cloy the appetites they feed, but she makes hungry where she most satisfies. And she's quite a sensuous and dangerous figure, and you'll hear her theme. We start out with a fanfare. For our brass section, you get a chance to see and hear them. The second movement presents the 2 themes. The sort of noble theme from the brass is Mark Antony. The oboe melody is the melody of Cleopatra. Then the last movement is the Battle of Actium. So I'll take you a little bit back to ancient Rome and ancient Egypt, 1 century BC, when all that takes place. The next piece is about a pair of lovers that we don't know, and they are 2 young Chinese students. It's a very ancient legend in China. This piece, again, might be new for many of you, but it is probably the most often played piece in the world. And I say that because it is the single most popular piece in China. It is played all the time in China. It's very, very deeply beloved. And the story is, again, of 2 students who are studying at the conservatory, and they're very good friends. But there's a little wrinkle in that one of the young boys is actually a young girl. And the only way she could go to the conservatory is if she disguises herself as a boy. So they become best friends, and they're inseparable. We have, at the beginning, you hear their happy life together at school. But of course, she's fallen in love with him. He doesn't realize she's a girl. She returns to her home to find that her father has arranged a marriage for her. and she's devastated, but the father is immovable. You hear the trombones, they're the symbol of the father in this case. Very, very fierce and very strong, that she must marry this person that he's chosen for her. Her friend from school comes to visit her, and to his shock, realizes that his best friend is a girl. But he falls in love with her then. I mean, he's been falling in love with her anyway, not realizing that she was a girl. And he dies of a broken heart. She prays at his tomb, and she pours out her grief to the gods, and in a miracle, the tomb opens, and she throws herself into the tomb in grief. She can't be separated from him. And at the very end, 2 butterflies fly out of the tomb together. And so that's why it's called Butterfly Lovers. So the violin really represents this young girl, and the happiness of her life at school, the tribulations that she has, this terrible situation where she doesn't want to marry the person that she must marry, and then finally this transfiguration where she becomes a butterfly, or her soul, their souls fly off together. The solo cello, when you hear the solo cello playing, is his voice singing to her, and there's a lot of beautiful writing for the flute and for the harp as well. But this is a very, very important piece in China, and we're happy to have you hear something completely different. The second half of the concert also based on Shakespeare. This is, again, one of Shakespeare's great, great plays, Romeo and Juliet. And Berlioz, Hector Berlioz, was an unbelievable fan of Shakespeare. He discovered Shakespeare when he was in his mid-20s, because it was only at that time, this is in the first quarter of the 19th century, that Shakespeare was finally translated into French, and people could read it in French. And Berlioz read every play as it was being translated into French, and he was amazed by Shakespeare. In fact, he said he had 2 heroes, Beethoven and Shakespeare. It was pretty good to think about those two noble people, and he patterned his life after these 2 people, and he read everything he could, and then he heard the exciting news that a company was coming from England to perform Romeo and Juliet in Paris. So of course he was there. Now, he didn't understand a word of English. He didn't speak English at all, but he knew. I mean, he had read it in French. He was able to follow, and the young actress, who was an Irish actress named Harriet Smithson, who played Juliet, was supposedly very, very beautiful and had an enchanting voice, and Berlioz fell completely in love with her. So he made up his mind instantly that Juliet was the epitome of beauty and truth. He said, and I shall marry Juliet, and I will write my largest work about this play. And he did both. He married Juliet. He married Harriet Smithson. She was also the woman about whom he wrote the Symphonie Fantastique. If you remember this crazy piece of the artist who's fallen in love with a woman who doesn't return his affections. That was about Harriet Smithson too. So he finally did marry her, and that marriage might not have been happy, but whatever. It had a very romantic start anyway when they first got married. He was thinking of writing this piece for a long time, from 1827, when he first saw Harriet Smithson on the stage and first saw this live performance of Romeo and Juliet. Its final version did not happen until 20 years later. And partly it was because Berlioz knew this was going to be a major undertaking. The full piece is extremely long. It's, I think, almost 2 hours in length, and it calls for chorus and soloists, and it's kind of like a play with music. It's what he called a music drama, or dramatic symphony, I think he called it. And in fact, Wagner, who saw the first performance, claimed that he based all of his operas on this concept, on Berlioz's concept of this dramatic symphony, that his music dramas, as he called his operas, were based on that. But it was a very big undertaking, and Berlioz was very poor, and he was not able to actually do it until he received a wonderful present. And this was very unexpected, and it came from an unexpected source too, Niccolo Paganini. Years before, Paganini had actually gotten a gift from Berlioz. Now, Paganini, of course, you know, is the incredible violin virtuoso. But Paganini went through phases in his life where he picked up other instruments and became a virtuoso on other instruments too. And for a short time, he even became a guitar virtuoso for a while. But he had a viola phase of his life where he was playing viola and loving viola and, playing it at an unbelievable level. And Berlioz was so struck by Paganini's viola playing that he wrote a piece for him as a gift. He wrote a piece called Harold in Italy. It was based on the Lord Byron poem. Harold was the viola. The viola was the voice of Child Harold in this play. And he gave it to Paganini as a present, and Paganini said, "It's too easy for me." And he never played it. It just wasn't virtuosic enough for Paganini. I mean, if you know some of the writing that Paganini wrote for himself, it was filled with unbelievable pyrotechnics. I mean, Paganini being probably the greatest virtuoso of all time. So he never played it. 20 years later, Paganini heard another violist play this piece, and he was filled with remorse. He felt that, well, maybe he had matured a little bit. He felt, I turned this wonderful gift down. I didn't even play it. I didn't even look at it, really. And he was so ashamed of himself that he sent Berlioz a present of 20,000 francs, which was like a fortune at that time. Paganini was very wealthy. He sent him a check for 20,000 francs. And he said, Beethoven is dead. Only you can bring him to life again. Write whatever you want. So with this money, Berlioz took the time, set everything else aside, and finally wrote his Romeo and Juliet. So it's really because of Paganini's gift that we have this. Now, what you hear tonight is the 4 orchestral sections in the piece. As I said, the piece calls for voices, calls for chorus, but Berlioz had sections that were for orchestra alone, and I'll tell you about the 4. We've made them actually into a kind of Romeo and Juliet symphony. There are 4 movements. We start out with the introduction, and this is, you remember how the play begins. The Capulets and Montagues are, sort of agitating each other on the stage, and there's a lot of tumult and unease, and you can tell there's agitation. You'll hear that in the orchestra. This is the strife between the Capulets and Montagues. You hear the strings, and then the brass comes in. Finally, though, in the middle of that movement, the trombones interrupt everything because the princes come on stage or come into the square. And you remember the prince says, cease your fighting. This cannot go on. You have to, you cannot continue to kill each other and hurt each other. It has to stop. And you'll hear, Berlioz chooses the trombones. They're very regal. They're very majestic for the voice of the prince saying, enough of this strife. It has to be over. So that's the first movement, the agitation of the Capulets and Montagues and the prince calling for peace. That movement goes with very little pause into one of the most beautiful things that Berlioz ever wrote, the love scene. He uses no words, no song, no voice for that. It's all orchestral music. It's the garden of the Capulets, where he has seen Juliet and he's watching her in the balcony, and it's the most expressive and passionate music. It's really incandescent music. The cellos and violas, the low voice, the voice of Romeo speaking to Juliet. Romeo speaking to Juliet through the instruments, not through words. And Juliet is reflected in the woodwinds in this kind of agitated, tender, kind of fearful ecstasy. The two of them are swept up in something that they can barely understand. And you imagine the sounds of this beautiful Italian night and how beautiful the garden must be, and this wonderful, passionate declaration of love. And Berlioz writes truly some of the most beautiful music from our entire literature in this one movement. The next movement is something quite different. It's something that was only a small detail in the play, and very often when we think of Romeo and Juliet, we don't remember this detail. It's called Queen Mab. Now, Queen Mab, you might remember, Romeo is reporting to his cousin, Mercutio, that he's fallen in love. And Mercutio doesn't believe him because it seems that Romeo has had a whole number of girlfriends, and it's always one girl, and the week it's another girl the next week. So Mercutio's making fun of him, and Romeo's saying, no, this is different. This is different. I have to tell you, this is something that is I'm in love with Juliet. And Mercutio tells him, oh, it's only Queen Mab. There was this kind of a legend then that Queen Mab was called the fairy's midwife. Instead of delivering babies, she would put impossible dreams into the minds of men. That's what she did. While they were sleeping, she'd put a little dream into their heads. And so it was just like a little legend. So he says, it's just Queen Mab. And Shakespeare's description of this kind of elfin creature, like a little Tinkerbell or something, corresponds so beautifully to Berlioz's music. He's writing fairy music. He's writing a picture of this fairy. And it's just amazing, this little elfin creature. If you remember Mendelssohn Midsummer Night's Dream music, this is like that in a very real way, this portrait of Queen Mab. It's brilliant. It's a little scary as well because there's something a bit malevolent about Queen Mab. So I'm just going to read you this poem. This is Shakespeare's words about what Queen Mab, who she is, so that when you hear the music, you make this connection. She is the fairy's midwife, and she comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone on the forefinger of an alderman, drawn with a team of little atomies athwart men's noses as they lie asleep. For a chariot, she has a nutshell fashioned by a squirrel. Her wagon spokes are made of long spinner's legs, the cover of the wings of grasshoppers, her reins of the smallest spider's web, her harness of moonbeams, her whip of a cricket's bone, the lash of film. Her wagoner is a small gray-coated gnat, not half so big as a round little worm. That's who Berlioz captures in this incredible music. So you hear Queen Mab. The final movement actually is a little bit out of order, but it's always done this way in this Berlioz symphony. It goes back to the beginning where Romeo is wandering at the Capulets' party alone. You remember he's been forbidden to go there because they can't have any more trouble, but he goes by himself and he's wandering and you hear this kind of lonely, just insecure music about a young man who doesn't know what he's doing and, is filled with anxiety and loneliness, and that's Romeo, the beginning of this. And in between, you keep hearing music intervening from the party in the other room. It gets louder and louder. Finally, we end this symphony with the full-scale sound of the party in full throttle, the party at the Capulets. So we went back to the beginning just to put them together in a sort of symphonic form. But it really is extraordinary music from a composer of extraordinary imagination. It's amazing to hear this music and to think that Berlioz was writing around the same time as Schubert and Mendelssohn were writing. I mean, his imagination is so wild in the best sense, and you'll hear this in this kind of pictorial drama of this great play. So as I mentioned to you, you won't hear any words or any singing or anything like this. This 40 minutes that you hear of the music is all of his orchestral sections. I think Berlioz would have feel okay about this and be happy about it because he really saved the most sublime parts of the story for the orchestra alone. And I want to read you what he says, why he did that. So Berlioz explains, the sheer beauty of this love story renders depiction so hazardous that I've lent my imagination a freedom which the limiting sense of words would never allow. For the deepest, most sublime moments, I resort to the language of the orchestra alone, a language richer, more vivid, freer, and more powerful than any words could ever be. So you hear the story in his orchestra writing. So we hope you enjoy our portrait of 3 couples from all over the world, all different times. Thank you for being with us tonight, and we hope that you have a wonderful experience listening to music you might not have heard before. Thank you.